What does it even mean to use the term original text? I'm going to use one book of the New Testament as a particular example, 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians is one of the letters written by Paul to his congregation in the city of Corinth, one of the Pauline epistles. It can illustrate well why scholars are reluctant these days to talk about the original text on theoretical grounds. To begin with, we are missing the original. Whatever Paul wrote, we no longer have it. Our earliest copy of 2 Corinthians is a manuscript called P46. It dates from around the year 200. 2 Corinthians was probably written sometime in the 60s, and so we're talking about a manuscript that was 140 years after the original is our first manuscript of it. And it's not a complete manuscript. Our first complete manuscript of 2 Corinthians does not come until about the year 350. In other words, nearly 300 years of copying, with mistakes being made everywhere along the line before we have the first complete copy. So that's obviously a problem, but it's not the big problem I want to talk about. There are theoretical problems with even imagining what it might mean to call a text the original text of 2 Corinthians for several reasons. First, this first thing it might seem a little picayune and trite to you, but in fact it's actually kind of interesting. We have good evidence that Paul dictated his letters to scribes who wrote down what he said. In other words, he didn't write himself, he dictated. We have solid evidence of this in the New Testament itself. We also have solid evidence from antiquity that when scribes took dictation, they often made mistakes. They misheard a word, somebody in the room coughed, or they didn't hear it right, they weren't paying attention, they wrote something down wrong. Suppose Paul dictated what we're calling 2 Corinthians and the scribe wrote down wrong words. What is the original text? Is it the words that Paul spoke or the words that the scribe wrote down? We don't have access to what Paul spoke, just what was written down, but what was written down might have had mistakes in it. Moreover, suppose what happened was what happened frequently in the ancient world, which is that the author looked at the written text once it had been written down and made corrections to it. Then what is the original text? Is the original text what the scribe originally wrote, or is it what Paul corrected? If it's what Paul corrected, then we're in the ironic situation that the later form of the text is being called the original text. And that could have happened a lot. But as I said, you might think that's a kind of a minor matter, and it's not the biggest problem. It's just an interesting problem. There's a bigger problem with respect to Paul writing 2 Corinthians, which is that Paul did not write 2 Corinthians. Paul did not write the letter of 2 Corinthians as it has come to us today. Scholars have long recognized for over a century that 2 Corinthians is made up of at least two different letters that have been spliced together. Chapters 10 through 13 do not come from the same letter as chapters 1 through 9. Not only that, there's a large number of scholars in both the United States and in Europe who maintain that 2 Corinthians, in fact, is made up of 5 separate letters that Paul wrote. In other words, Paul wrote 5 letters, and they were put in circulation and were copied and changed. 5 letters. These were circulated and changed until somebody created our 2 Corinthians by taking parts of these 5 letters and cutting them and pasting them together. This is a standard view in scholarship. You will find this taught in every major research university in North America, what I'm telling you now. This is not some kind of crazy idea that a particularly liberal professor at Chapel Hill thinks, although it is that. But it's not just that. This is standard fare in virtually everybody who's a critical scholar agrees with what I've just told you. But what does that mean then? Somebody created the letter some years, maybe a couple of decades after Paul wrote, so that Paul didn't create 2 Corinthians. Paul created up to 5 letters that had been in circulation and probably changed that were then combined into 2 Corinthians with a lot of the stuff cut out and other stuff put together. Then this letter, this amalgam, is put in circulation, and it's changed over time. And then something else happens that's equally significant, even more significant. It was argued over 50 years ago by one of the great scholars of the world of textual criticism, a man named Günther Zuntz, that around the year 100, some editor came along and collected the letters of Paul into one manuscript. That there were separate letters that were floating around, being transmitted here, there, and the other, and somebody collected them into a collection, and this collection was published. This editor who collected the letters put the letters together and possibly put his own stamp on them. In other words, edited these letters to make them fit together into the collection. And then it was the collection that was put in circulation. Zuntz argued that all of our letters of Paul go back to that collection. This is not a weird point of view by just one particular scholar. Günther Zuntz's view has been supported by scholarship ever since, most recently supported, for example, by a very important book written by Harry Gamble, who, I'm sorry to say, teaches at the University of Virginia. But he's a nice guy anyway, and he's very smart, and he's one of the most recent people to argue this, that the Pauline letters were not circulated just individually around the year 100, they're put into a collection, and that all of our manuscripts of the letters of Paul go back to that collection. Or there may have been even more than one collection. But the Pauline letters were not circulating individually, they were circulated in collection, and as they circulated in the collection, of course, they got changed as scribes changed the manuscript. And so this leads us to the very pressing problem: what is the original of 2 Corinthians? It's a great question, and there's not an easy answer to it. There are a couple of obvious options. You could say that 2 Corinthians was the original letter that Paul wrote. Well, apart from the problems of dictation, you've got the problem that Paul didn't write a letter. Paul wrote 5 letters, or 3, or 2. He wrote several letters, and 2 Corinthians was not one of them. 2 Corinthians was a later amalgam made by a later editor of Paul. So the original writing of Paul is not the original 2 Corinthians. So maybe you could say that the copy that was later created by cutting and pasting is the original 2 Corinthians. Well, you could say that, but Paul didn't write that. He wrote the individual letters that were later cut and pasted together. Moreover, we don't have access to this letter that was made by combining these various letters. What we have access to is the collection, because we don't have manuscripts that go back to the letters that were circulating independently before the collection. All of the manuscripts that we have go back to the collection. We can't get behind the collection. And so, what is the original? And who is to say? We can't reconstruct anything before the collection was made, because we don't have any manuscripts that go back to those individual letters before that event. But if we try to reconstruct the original form of the collection, that's not the original form of the text that Paul himself wrote. Moreover, the one letter we're interested in the collection, 2 Corinthians, was not one letter, but 3 or 4 or 5. This is a very confusing situation, but it's the historical reality, which is one of the reasons why top scholars throughout the English-speaking world have abandoned the idea that we can reconstruct some kind of original text. It's impossible to know even what it means to speak of an original.